So myself and Matt have done a little talk about our project so far and what we thought of it, sort of going over the project creation process, what we've learned and what we could have improved on and why we chose this style and genre and that sort of thing. I thought I'd just do a quick rundown of my personal views and opinions on the project and just talk about it, so just ignore that. So first things first, I think for the situation and circumstances that we've been under over the course of the COVID-19 crisis, I think we've managed to make something that I'm personally happy with and quite proud of in terms of my simulations. In regards to the scene assembly and the actual flow of the piece, obviously it all looks still a bit rough around the edges because it's all still a previs, and we'll be sort of submitting a previs that isn't this one, but I'm going to talk about. But a previs that's you could argue that it was edging towards an actual render. Obviously, we don't have the access or the ability to put everything on a render farm right now because everything has been a nightmare of getting files simply from just me and Matt. So being able to get everything from my computer at home all the way onto the drives and stuff, which I've been having problems with the access remotely to the Uni computers anyway. I just don't think it's going to work at this point in time, but that's something we're going to work towards at the end of the process for our show reels once everything's sort of settled down a bit. So yeah, I'm just going to talk about the project first, the previs. So yeah, make sure it's playing properly. So first things first, there's a main scene within the whole project which we consistently come back to, which depicts the astronaut meeting their untimely demise, unfortunately, after they've been blown away from the satellite they've been working on, and their helmet has shattered, causing them to suffocate in space and unfortunately die. So, as mentioned in the video with Matt, the main inspiration sort of behind why we've taken this route was we wanted to go with something a bit different this semester over the stuff we've created before. And we both sort of agreed on the idea of space being something we've never tackled before. It's like low gravity, so it makes for unique simulations and stuff like that. Following the sort of inspiration from the Dead Island trailer that we talked about in the other video, where it's all sort of in reverse and slow motion, we wanted to do something quite like that, where it's about a story of a character, in this case the astronaut, where there isn't a nice payout at the end, because everything nowadays usually has a happy ending, and we just didn't want to do something like that. We wanted something where it was unique and it stood out from everything else because of story reasons and obviously the simulations and stuff. So that's the reason we've gone down, or I think we've gone down this route. Doing something a bit out there, a bit differently. Obviously, it's not looking up to par completely right now, but I can only imagine that it would be, considering the amount of time and effort we've put into setting up the scenes, getting all the assets, making all the simulations, having all the production meetings, making everything work together. So again, I've had a real joy working with Matt this semester. We've had more ups than downs. Obviously, it's always the way it is with working with a partner, but it's always nice to have someone that has your back to work on stuff like this, since this is my main scene and I set up a lot of the stuff, but Matt did also help me with assets and stuff, and especially with this cloth simulation, I would have no idea what I'm doing. And I think the same would go with him with the water simulations and how I've done the fractures. So, before talking about Matt's bit, let's get up a larger version of the scene here. So I just want to discuss the simulations I've been doing in the scene. So, because we're working in a sort of reverse order type thing in slow motion, we're almost working with still images, which essentially is the route I've taken to create these shatter simulations that look pretty impressive. They look really different from everything I've made before, because I've used the Voronoi fracture, which usually has a tell, which I've mentioned in my project, in my whatever you call it, in my Pebble pad. See here with Matt's simulation, because it's active, you can see the little chunks of like dead thick object that is the tell of a Voronoi fracture simulation. Whereas I've managed to make something where there is a large variation in pieces of simulation with the satellite itself, and this was simply achievable because of the fact that this is a still image. So I've made a cache of the shutter simulation of the object, simmed it out, cached it out, and then I've just taken one frame and then cleaned it up. So the benefits of this are obviously that, unlike Matt's scene, I don't have the little tiny pieces floating about, but due to how I've set this up differently than what I'd normally do, I could play this simulation and all of these like piece variety would still be there, due to like instead of painting one little area, I've sort of scattered the points throughout the whole object using the paint node, which I discussed how to create in my shutter simulation entry on my Pebble. But I've sort of made little intersection points where I want the simulation or the collisions to be, which is one up here, one down there, and one here. Instead of just making little pieces, I've spread all of the points out across these points, making sure to keep to the edges where there is unique geometry instead of little combined sections where it would make these little pieces, and simulated them there, resulting in a simulation that has nice variety, as well as being able to make a still frame where I can clean it up with the blast nodes after. Again, the other two main simulations have the little water sim down there, which I'll come on to a minute. It needs work, but I think for like what I've made, I think I'm very happy with it. And then the explosion simulations, which I've also covered in my Pebble pad. So these, I go into less detail in these because I've already spent way too long talking about the fracture sim, but it was at least with the explosion pyro simulation, it was really cool and like nice to work with something different for a change, because I'm quite used to working with water sim, not in this way at all, and fracture sim, but also again not in that way. Usually doing the Voronoi in a very simple way, and I did it in a different way this time. But it was nice to sort of work with the fireball pyro effects to make something that looks sort of realistic in compared to like a fake cartoony explosion, something that I did in second semester with the Lego explosion. So it was nice to work with a fireball simulation which was different from those, since it just from how I conducted it this time, started completely differently, using a sphere node with a mountain attached to it to sort of change the shape and the size of the object, allowing it to have like a different shape when it explodes, as it's got more surface area to sort of expand out of. So that was really fun to create, and I'm happy with that. And obviously if it wasn't in ambient occlusion, it'd be textured, and I've got a render of it on my Pebble pad that I'm very happy with, even though it's like it was a low scale render. If that was upscaled, it looked really good. In regards to this water simulation, it was an absolute nightmare, and at this point in time I've got some tweaks I want to apply to it. But the point is, it's some water blobs floating in space that sort of just don't apply to the normal form of physics. So I thought this would be easy enough to do with, since I worked with water simulation last semester, to just make a flip fluid object and just create that in space with no gravity and just separate it. But that wasn't the case. If you did that, you'd get a giant stream of weird stringy liquid that didn't look right at all. So I messed with the viscosity, that's like how thick it is, and that didn't work at all either. So I had to sort of go online, obviously, to find tutorials and stuff, and there was no one giving tutorials on this. So I had to find a scene that someone else had created and reverse engineer it, and that was a whole process, and It was really complicated how to make, and I I couldn't recite how I did it to you without referring back to my Pebble Pad, just simply because of how weird it was. If I can get that up, I've got a time lapse video of me creating it, which obviously goes into more detail of how it's actually done. It's a nice little 6-minute video. So just like setting up a sphere and then setting up flip fluid solvers instead of using the shelve tool, and then coming to something else, making a different node in the OBJ for the surface, and then it all combines together to make this weird thing at the end that combines together, and it was the whole thing. For what it is, I'm happy with it, but it definitely needs to be changed. The relevance of this water simulation in the scene is little to none right now. I originally had it so it was going to be like leaking from the astronaut sort of suit, obviously because there's going to be water in there, H2O. But this doesn't really work, so I'm going to change this from the blue texture that it's got to a red texture, and resize it and maybe resim it scale so it's blood droplets coming out of the guy's nose. So it just sort of fits into the scene better and just has more of a purpose. So I'm just going to discuss really my stuff in this video, since me and Matt have already talked about the stuff we've done together. So like I think the rocket stuff he's done this semester looks really cool. He's done tests and simulations of this smoke, and unfortunately in this scene it looks dead dark for whatever reason, but I know it doesn't actually look like that. Moving on to other changes I want to personally make into the scenes before we finally submit it, relates to this scene. The point of this was to sort of show pictures of the astronaut's child, the time they spent together, which would come floating in, which would then trigger like another flashback section to where the astronaut was alive. These pictures just sort of float into frame without any purpose and just stop, as well as taking way too much focus from the background, which seems to stop moving, so that's something weird that's happened there that I need to change. But I'm aiming to animate all of these pictures to be a bit more random and sporadic in their movement, instead of just casually floating into the screen and then stopping. But yeah, so I think that's something that could be changed, and once I do, I think I'll be happy with it, and then it could be rendered for a final piece. Something that I'm happy with in the time frame that I made with the resources I've got relates to this climbing situation of this astronaut. So obviously, making a climbing simulation where there's like animation in the character's hands and stuff like that is going to be very difficult without access to mocap suits that have sensors in the hands, Maya, which I would mainly use for rigging and keyframe animating on characters, which I don't have access to currently due to hardware limitations, and stuff like that. So I used assets that I gathered from Mixamo, which is a website that allows you to get models and sort of animations for those models, and brought them into the scene with some handlebars map modeled and sort of lined it all and synced it all up, as well as time warping the animation itself to make it slower for space, obviously, because the normal ladder climbing animation was it was way too fast for being in space. And then also took advantage of the end of the animation by setting it in first person, so I could have the character look to the side to stare at the Earth to sort of appreciate its beauty. Right now, because obviously there's only a certain amount of frames of a animation that's preset. So if I had it as third person, I didn't have the camera as the person's head, they would just awkwardly be chilling space and they'd have no purpose. Whereas here it looks like they're like sort of hanging off, appreciating the view. So I think I made a really good workaround based on the assets and sort of available stuff we had with us. Moving on to the last things I sort of did. So again, we've got close-ups of all the simulation work I've done, the fractures, obviously, got the nice variation, got little parts of the beams, we've got big parts of the solar panels. We've got the explosion simulation that I've done, which is actually 3 separate pyro simulations all combined into one to sort of give it the sort of a big, well, just to make it look like a big explosion, because obviously in space, if an explosion is going to happen, it's going to be short and fast, 2 seconds max, and this being like a very slowed down, sort of almost freeze frame version of our scene, because it's all in reverse slow motion. I just think this works really well. It gets across the size and volume of the explosion and sort of the actual devastation that's being caused on here. And then we've just got more scenes with the astronaut climbing and the blacking out and stuff. So yeah, for what we've got right now, at this point in time, which will still be updated with the changes I've mentioned before the final deadline, I'm quite happy with what we've made, with the limitations of all the COVID-19 stuff. And yeah, I'm just really happy with sort of my personal growth over the project, as I've been experimenting with new forms of simulation that, like, I thought I basically knew everything to do with how I like to shatter objects and how I do water simulation. And going through this project, I've learned that there's so much more, and there's so many unique and different ways I can implement these sorts of things into a project, as well as going back to pyro effects, which I've always sort of liked the look of, but never really had the I've never had the chance to properly incorporate it into a project over like the last year before now, because there was never any need to. Since last semester, I did something horror related that mainly focused on water simulation. But yeah, I think I've noted down what I would change. We picked this style obviously due to technical limitations, but I also really like the look of something being in ambient occlusion as a render. Obviously this is just a previs, it's not an ambient occlusion render, but the other videos on my PebblePad, the first previs is in an ambient occlusion render, and it just sort of, that style really adds to the lonely feel of space that we're going for, which is why the story doesn't really have a payout. It doesn't have like a happy ending, because sometimes that's just how it goes. You know, not everything ends in a sort of happy way of, oh, the astronauts kids at least knew he was thinking about them before he died. No, it's just a sad tale, unfortunately, that could happen to any astronaut in space trying to do repairs and stuff. But yeah, given the chance to develop this further, we'd like to obviously expand on all the simulations, get it rendered out properly for our show reels, that sort of thing. But that's something to worry about after the fact. At the moment, we want to get everything done for our final submission and sort of just work from there. Oh, cool. Yeah, that's just all I wanted to talk about in regards to our previs and all the simulations and stuff I've done. I obviously go into in depth more in my portfolio itself on why I've made the things the way I have, and sort of going through the process in a more in-depth way of how I create the things, how I create the simulations and the scene and stuff. But yeah, thanks for watching this little breakdown or talk about why I've done stuff. Thank you.